it occurred to me that given what's going on in the world, that the subject of being present with fear, working with fear, would be timely in terms of what's going on. We hear about, well, if this person gets elected, we're all going to hell in a handbasket, or if that person gets elected. And just watching how much fear is a part of this election that's pending out there, and how much of a powerful motivator it is, which we'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes. But that was sort of what prompted the topic. And certainly we all know that this is something we all experience. It's just part of being human. It comes in all kinds of forms: worry, impending doom, physical anxiety, physical symptoms, tension, panic, anxious anticipation, and on and on. But what all of these have in common is a sympathetic response. Remember that part of the nervous system which is activating. And when it's activated, our response is flight, fight, or freeze, and how we experience that. And if you think about that, we've only in fairly recent time added freeze to the list. But as we've learned more about trauma and dealing with trauma, that really has kind of emerged as an important part. Because if you think about a developing child who's in a traumatic situation, they can't really flee, they can't really fight, so they tend to freeze, they tend to just shut down. And it can be so disruptive to emotional development. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. But we call that the stress response, just that response, that sympathetic arousal, the stress response. And the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys. They just sit there waiting for us to get triggered. And when we do, they sort of spit adrenaline into the bloodstream, and we have this whole physical response. Our respiration increases, our digestion slows, our blood flow goes into the main core of the body and out of the extremities. It prepares us for fight, flight, or in some cases freeze. We hyperventilate, the heart rate increases. There's a whole way that we can look at this and experience this. And certainly most mammalian species experience this. It's so critical to survival. And it really is crucial to survival. If you think about our ancestors on the savannah 40, 50,000 years ago, this is what allowed them to survive. The tribe that took care of things, that planned for the winter, had enough food, worried about having enough food, that was the tribe that was going to survive. The tribe that didn't pay attention to that, their genes got washed out of the gene pool because they weren't adequately attending to the fear, the anxiety about survival. The problem is we just haven't really evolved that far beyond that 40,000 year ago human, and that we have so many fewer things in our lives, at least in this country, about which to have that kind of dramatic response, basic survival, being prey for some large animal on the savannah or whatever. But we still have this response. We still experience what they experience. We just have less circumstances in which it's really beneficial in terms of an immediate threat to our survival. And so it's always kind of humming in the background. It's not so crucial. It is crucial to our survival in some ways, but certainly nowhere near what our ancient ancestors did. It's just hanging back there waiting to get triggered or waiting to get activated. So I want to just give you a little more background about fear and anxiety, and then we'll talk about it, sort of how it fits with the Dharma and with our practice. So to be really precise, we would need to make a distinction between fear and anxiety. And I'll give you an example. So if I'm walking down the street and I'm getting ready to cross the street, and here comes a car screaming around the corner and it's coming right for me, and I jump out of the way and my heart rate increases and I'm sweating and I'm shaking and I'm frightened, that's fear, because there was a direct threat to me in that moment. But if I go out there tomorrow and I'm crossing the street and there's no car and I have that same response, remembering what happened yesterday, that's anxiety. Now, I'm not going to belabor that, and I'm actually going to be somewhat imprecise tonight and use the terms interchangeably. But the importance of that is that so much of our anxiety is based upon our anticipation or our imagination. That's where we really tend to get into a little bit of problem with this response. So I'm going to use those terms interchangeably just for convenience, but there is that distinction for what it's worth. And it's always about either remembering the danger that I experienced yesterday or earlier today, or anticipating a danger that perhaps has never even happened. You know, the classic thing is, I get on an airplane and we think, oh my gosh, this one's going to crash. You know, we don't think the odds of that are less than being struck by lightning, but we get ourselves quite anxious anticipating that that could happen, or any number of other imagined fears that we have. Getting stuck in an elevator, getting bitten by a dog, whatever that might be. But it's that same residual or anticipatory anxiety that really did help our ancestors survive, because once they developed the capacity cognitively to imagine these things, then they could take steps to avoid them. They could imagine what the winter would be like with no food in the cave and take steps to alleviate that. So it was really critical to survival. And as I said, we're still dealing with that evolutionary heritage. One of the interesting things about anxiety, and this goes way back to my graduate school days, is that sort of horseshoe-shaped curve where we know that too little or too much anxiety can really hinder performance. There's a real sweet spot at sort of the top of that curve where we need enough anxiety to perform optimally. When you talk to professional athletes, they really get pumped up. They want to find that sweet spot because they know that that's where they're going to perform the best. If they get too anxious, not so much. If they don't care, not so much. But right there, that's really important to how we perform. And if you think about it in your work life or in other challenging situations, it's really appropriate to have that certain amount of anxiety to really be at the top of our game. So shifting now to our practice and how all this fits into meditation and to the Dharma. So what happens as we start to deepen our practice, particularly on retreats, but not just on retreats, is invariably some of our fears and anxieties will start to bubble up. We get quiet, and the next thing we know, the world's coming to an end, or my kid's going to have a car wreck tonight, or while I'm away on retreat, or whatever it might be. And so it can become a real part of our challenge in our practice is how do we manage this? How do we grapple with it? How do we make it something that doesn't derail us or make us want to just hang it up and not get quiet, because getting quiet can bring up some of these fears, some of these worries. So if you've heard my talks in the past, I've talked about things like suffering can be a teacher, other experiences can be a teacher. Well, I think fear and anxiety can also be a real important teacher in terms of guiding us and giving us some impetus to stay on this path. And it also really, rather than just meaninglessness, suffering with anxiety or fear, it really allows us to work with it, gives us some tools to work with it, and also using it just to make progress on our path. And it really comes down to working with it mindfully, is everything we talk about. So if it's coming up, as I said in the meditation earlier, whatever's coming up, we welcome it, we accept it, we acknowledge it, we work with it, we don't push it away, we don't run from it. And these experiences are so often, they're highly subjective. What mine is different from yours, what yours is different from mine. But what we all have in common is that sooner or later we're going to have it, and sooner or later we're going to have to figure out a way to deal with it. And I would argue that the more established our practice is and the further along we are on the path, the less likely this stuff is going to really escalate into full-blown panic, apprehension, terror, whatever. Because the thing that really maintains fear and anxiety is avoidance. Avoidance is our challenge in so many aspects of the practice, facing stuff that's just not pleasant to face. And so much of it brings with it fear and anxiety. And if we're avoiding it, trying to push it away, get away from it, run away from it, it's just going to continue to plague us. That's sort of the paradox of it. And so I think the challenge is just learning to be with it in whatever form it takes, as we would with any other experience, any other thing that arises during our practice, during our meditation, or even off the cushion. Ajahn Sumedho, who's a Theravadan monk, talks about this in some of his writings, and the point that he makes is that we really need to work to disidentify with our fear, not say this is who I am. I'm a fearful, anxious person. But he would say instead, anxiety's happening, this is happening right now, not to get over-identified with it. He says anxiety is like this, meaning whatever's going on at the moment. Fear is like this, whatever's going on in the moment. Sort of making that mental notation. In all the years, and I'll get into this further in a few minutes, in my practice as a psychologist before I retired, was so many people would come in and be heavily identified with their symptoms. They'd come in and say, I'm just the most anxious person you've ever met, as though that's the totality of who they were. And one of the first things I would want to challenge is, well, let's talk about that and get a little disidentification going with that, so we can sort of set it out there and talk about it. As long as you carry that notion around, that's who you're going to be, that's what your experience in your life is going to be. So, that all being said, if there's a legitimate thing going on, if there's a truck coming for me or whatever, it makes perfect sense. But if I'm walking around, jumping out of my skin every time I hear a noise, or I perceive a verbal threat, or worry about something that's really highly unlikely to occur, that's when I'm really not skillfully working with this experience in my life. And as I said, so much of it is anticipatory in nature. There may not even be any specific immediate threat right now, right here. One of the interesting things about, I guess one of the more severe forms of anxiety is panic disorder. Panic attacks are terrifying. It's a full-blown sympathetic response that's just, everything's at 100%. And the folks that experience that, what they then develop is really a fear of that fear. They're anxious about that anxiety. And so anytime, once they become hypervigilant about their own bodily response. So they've had a panic attack a week ago. They come in and they say, they're just hypervigilant, like, is my heart beating? Is my heart starting to beat? Is my breathing off? And they're constantly hypervigilant about what's going on in their own body. And what they're trying to do is avoid that. They're doing everything they can to distract themselves, avoid it, run away from it, whatever, because what happens is once that begins to happen, then the adrenaline kicks in, because they treat it as though there's a really valid fear right in front of them, and then another panic attack occurs. So anything that signals the onset of it will in fact trigger it. And what do we know about it from all the research, and all the good research really in the last 30, 40 years, we've come a long way in thinking about it, is that you have to be able to be with those internal sensations. We talk about experiential avoidance, the term meaning trying to avoid my experience. That is so polar opposite to what we try to do with our sitting practice and with our Dharma, where we want to just be with it. Okay, my heart's racing. Okay, I can be with that. Not, oh my God, here comes a panic attack. It's a real clear example of how avoidance versus acceptance can really perpetuate the disorder. Now, having said that, in the larger sense, how are we with accepting the frailty and the temporary nature of our existence? How are we with accepting that we can never be absolutely safe? That's just part of the deal. There's plenty of things we get anxious about that probably make no sense. But part of what we sometimes get anxious about is just accepting things as they are. Pat teaches this a lot, where, can we just accept this is the way life is? That it's frail, it's temporary, it's impermanent. Everybody I love and care about is going to disappear at some point, maybe before me, maybe after me. Can I be with that? Can I make my peace with that? Or am I going to be anxious and worried and fretting and, oh my gosh, this is terrible. How could this be happening? How could this be happening to me? The Dharma teaches us that everything changes constantly, even and especially that which is most precious to us. It's just part of the deal. We can fight it, we can try to avoid it, or we can lean into it and accept it and have some sense of equanimity and serenity in our lives. It's really the price of being a conscious being. The more we increase our awareness and consciousness, the more this stuff is going to get in our face. If we're not trying to distract ourselves with busyness, with working too much, drinking too much, drugging too much, running too much, shopping too much, eating too much, the list goes on and on. If we get quiet, invariably this stuff is going to come up. That's the nature of what comes up in our practice. And it's not a flaw. It's part of the human experience. So many people I can remember would come into my office and say, "What's wrong with me? I'm anxious." Well, you're human. Sorry, it's part of the deal. Let's look at it. Let's look at how you're responding to it. We're not going to get rid of it, but we may be able to change your relationship to it. You may be able to find a way to be with it. You'll often hear me say when I talk that, the Buddha was the most amazing psychologist in the history of our species. The man, all those years ago, we're finally reinventing the wheel and realizing that everything he taught was pretty much right on in terms of current scientific and psychological research. And so what often happens is that for some people, when that awareness of our vulnerability and all the fragility and all the impermanence around us, it can really just knock us off our feet. We can become incredibly anxious. We can become depressed. We can just get really distraught. Or we can work with it. We can be present with it. We can show up for it. And what I think is a huge value of the spiritual practice that we do is that we're able to come to terms with our anxiety in a conscious way. And once we do that, our life really begins to integrate. We're not walking around with blinders on trying to make sure we don't bump into something which is going to make me anxious or something that's going to trigger me. We create that spaciousness. We open to all experience. The joy, the sorrow, the serenity, the anxiety, whatever it might be. It's all part of the deal. We're not trying to avoid that which is true. We can sit down intellectually and write out what is true about life, but it doesn't mean we're really emotionally, spiritually embracing it. Without our practice, I think we just compound the suffering. We just stack it up. Worry, fear, anxiety, this, whatever's going on, we don't lean into it. But once we sit and we begin to sit regularly and we get quiet, we watch our mind at work, we see how the untrained mind is so agitated and always vibrating. It's always fearful. And how that just can sweep us right up into a real chronic sense of worry and fear and anxiety. But with our practice, we learn to tolerate the unpleasantness of that, the uncertainty of that. We see it as natural. We see it as part of our journey. And we learn to be with it. And we can say, life is like this. Oh, I'm having a bad day. Well, life is like this. I'm very anxious this morning. Life is like this. What's going on? We can't fix it. We can't get rid of it. We're not supposed to do that. That's just not what life is about. But we gain the insight, and we gain the serenity and the happiness from accepting life as it is. So what's involved then with deepening our understanding of how this fear and anxiety affects us? First off, I think we wake up to both our internal and our external environment. What's going on in here, what's going on out there. I'm fully awake to it. I'm fully open to it. I'm creating some spaciousness with it. I'm not pushing it away. I'm not running away from it. And we recognize that when we perceive a possible danger, that our vigilance is going to ramp up a little bit. Okay, that's what happens. Oh, I noticed that. I'm aware that if I'm walking down a street alone 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to be more vigilant. That's probably a good thing to be. It's probably a better thing to be not to be there in the first place, but assuming I'm there. Because if not, then we ramp from vigilance to hypervigilance, and we keep ramping up that which is triggering us. But one of the problems with it, and certainly one of the problems with hypervigilance when we are fully anxious, is it really creates tunnel vision, because we just begin to see everything through the lens of fear and anxiety. We don't see anything else. And if you talk to people that are struggling with panic disorder, they'll tell you, that's their primary focus is always on watching for those symptoms, watching for that internal sensation that might tell them they're getting ready to experience a panic attack. And again, I use that because it's such a dramatic way to see all this play out when someone's struggling with that sort of thing. And what can happen over time is that this sort of chronic fear can really develop this sort of frozen traumatic experience. And where the nervous system is constantly pumping out adrenaline and on high alert, we really just are in a chronic state of heightened anxiety. And sometimes as we sit, stuff will come up and it'll really grab us. It'll really sort of sneak up on us and try to knock us over. And that's why it's so important in this practice to have this context, to have this understanding, have this perspective, so that we're open to expecting it. If I don't have any awareness of any of this and I sit and I get quiet and it comes up, it's just going to knock me right over. I don't know what it is. It's surprising. It's scary. It's new. It's confusing. Again, it's all about embracing rather than avoiding. We have a natural inclination to avoid or push away anything that's unpleasant. I have a headache, I better take some Tylenol. I can't sleep, I better take something else. I'm anxious, I better get away from it. I better find a way to distract myself. But what I think we find, and I've certainly found this in my own life, that if I stay with that uncomfortable experience, it really starts to kind of soften and unwind, because I'm just present with it. I'm not trying to micromanage it. I'm not trying to push it away or run away from it. And like every other experience, like we talked about tonight in the practice, it arises and then it passes. One of the things that's always amazing when you explain that to people that are struggling with high levels of anxiety is, well, is that the way you always are? Well, let's watch it. Let's break it down. Well, guess what? It's up and then it's down. It's up. It's not just one shade, one color, one experience. And again, that's the awareness. Oh, I can see that. I can see that it comes and goes. It's not who I am. I don't have to be fully identified with it. It's so many of us fall into this trap of habitually viewing the world through all of our fear, all those fearful lenses, that we really are living a fear-based or a fearful life. And the problem is when that's the case, there's just very little mental rest. There's very little opportunity for equanimity or serenity. Because life rarely seems safe, even temporarily. It just always seems like it's ready to bite us or knock us over. So we don't trust ourselves. We don't trust our own judgment. We don't trust the judgment of others. We're always second-guessing ourselves. We're always second-guessing others, wondering about their motivation. And very often we use worry or obsession as a way to just cope with it. If I worry enough, maybe I'll think of every possible thing that can happen to me and not be surprised. But worry is just another form of fear and anxiety. Early in my practice, I was just getting bombarded with this stuff whenever I'd sit. And what became so clear to me as I continued to sit, and believe me, there were times when I just wanted to give it up, was just how much my own life was fear-based. Fear of failure. I grew up in a family where you really had to perform at a high level. Fear. What if I screw up? What if I fail? Fear of disapproval, which was sort of the first cousin to the fear of failure. Fear of disappointing others, fear of letting others down. Fear of being found out to somehow not be authentically who I thought I was. It's just fear after fear after fear. And what I realized when I began to sit was that these were present for almost all of my waking existence. I mean, sometimes they were present when I was asleep, in terms of my dreams would be very, I would dream about being in exam, and this was the first time in the semester I'd even been in the class. And I'm thinking, how am I possible, that kind of performance fear about that would show up in my dream life. And it was just exhausting. It was exhausting. It was demoralizing. It affected my mood. It affected how I was with other people. And until I began to really work with it over time within my practice, it didn't shift, but it began to shift. And it became so clear to me about how much of my life was fear-based and motivated by that. And I was able to accept it. I was able to work with it. I was able to be with it in different ways. And over time, it's just gotten better and better. It's still there, but I recognize that I can work with it. I see it for what it is. I don't have to identify with it. I don't have to say, oh yeah, that's the truth about me. So that's where I think the practice can come in and say, okay, let's look at these fears. Let's welcome them in. As Rumi says, let's sit down and have a cup of tea with our fears and see what they look like. And the Buddha talks about this. He talks about this in the Pali Canon. In one of them, in the middle-length discourses, I think it's the fourth sutta there, it's fear and dread. And he's talking to a Brahmin about the qualities of a monk who lives alone in the forest. And then he talks about his own attempts to conquer fear while he was striving for enlightenment. And remember, the Buddha's sitting under the Bodhi tree, and Mara's coming with throwing everything he can at him, trying to bring beautiful women and seduce him, but fear and scaring stuff and everything. And what did the Buddha do? He just sat, he reached over and he touched the ground. He anchored himself and stayed with it, and Mara flew away. He was not having any luck with inducing fear, bringing doubt to the Buddha that he was going to become enlightened. It was a very dramatic moment. And so what I found really worked for me, and what I would really recommend is, finding out what's true for yourself in terms of mindfully looking at, sitting with, being with your fears, your anxieties. Maybe starting with some of the smaller ones, the more approachable ones. Pema Chodron has that wonderful thing where she talks about difficult emotions, and she says, just touch into it. You don't have to embrace the whole thing at once. Just touch into it periodically, see what you can stay with, be with, and then come back to it later and do it some more, and gradually work your way into it. We're not asking you to just face full frontal implosion therapy where we throw the whole basket at you at once. And patience is a critical part of this. Patience and faith. Faith in the way that Sharon Salzberg talks about it. Faith that if I stay with this, I work with this, my relationship with it is going to change. It's not going to go away, but my relationship with it's going to change. Many of us, when we're anxious and fearful, have a tendency to really beat ourselves up about it. Oh, I'm defective. What's wrong with me? And that's another thing we have to address with our practice, is that self-judgment that comes with experiencing fear, experiencing anxiety. Acknowledging that it's part of life, it's part of the deal. We're never going to be free of it, but we can certainly change our relationship with it. And that even if fear is consuming us, it's not all there is. It's one part of our experience. There's still love, there's still appreciation, generosity, caring, tolerance, patience, creativity, all of these other wonderful parts of the human journey. One of the core teachings is, it's sort of taken a different angle, is that fear and anxiety will inevitably arise whenever we have an experience of separateness from ourselves, from others, from the environment. And the other thing that practice does is it connects us. It connects us to our experience, connects us to others, it connects us to others in terms of compassion and an open heart. And if we deny that or push that away, things aren't going to be right. We're going to be fearful, anxious, depressed, whatever. So as we grow spiritually and the interdependence of all life becomes clear, then much of our fear starts to lose its grip. It's just another benefit of the practice, to be able to begin to have that sort of experience. One of the practices I think is really a good way of working with, or a good antidote for being over-identified with our fear and anxieties, is loving-kindness practice and self-compassion practice. I sort of always put those in tandem. You know, they sort of soften our self-judgment. They make it easier for us to look at stuff which feels so toxic or so loaded. If I'm bringing self-compassion and loving-kindness to myself, then it's much easier for me to look at these, shine the light in all those dark corners that I'd rather not look at. And some of the phrases that I find useful when I'm doing loving-kindness practice are things like, may I find freedom from fear in my life. May I help others to find freedom from fear. May I meet fear with courage and an open heart. Those sorts of loving-kindness messages. There's a wonderful story of a monk who lived in isolation in this cave in the Himalayas and painted these beautiful murals on the wall of the cave. That was part of his practice, these magnificent murals. And when he was really developing deep concentration, and he painted a ferocious tiger on the side of the wall. And the next morning when he got up and looked at it, it was so real that it scared him, and it scared him to death. He fell over dead. So at that moment, he was seeing this solid thing that he, in fact, had created, and not the sort of unchanging nature of all experience. So the idea is that when we get stuck with our fear, we're clinging to this perception like that mural painted on the walls of our mind. So it's like we paint these murals in our mind about what is fear, how I identify with it, what it means, what it says about me as a person. And then we react as though that were the final word, as though that were the truth of the matter. So we want to cultivate, really continue mindfulness of what's coming up for us. And in this instance, what's coming up in terms of fear, worry, anxiety, obsessions, whatever. We want to generate some real deep compassion for any suffering it's causing us. Not self-judgment, not berating ourselves, but true compassion. And then from that begin, and from our continued practice, to cultivate equanimity. The equanimity that allows us to stay with it, to be with the experience, to not get knocked over by it. Because if not, it can really restrict our lives. We can really become imprisoned by it. You know, people become housebound, they become agoraphobic, they won't leave, they are literally imprisoned by their fear and anxiety and their panic. It's not a trivial matter, but that's all the more reason for us to work with it skillfully. You know, we're seeing now, as I said earlier, how vulnerable we are to having our fears exploited in this time, this election season. You know, because fear, again, from the survival evolutionary perspective, it trumps most other drives. I mean, fear will trump hunger, thirst, sex, whatever, because it's the survival thing. And so if someone continually evokes that in us, it's going to be pretty motivating. And if you watch some of the reaction to some of the fearful campaign messages, you can see how it really galvanizes people and motivates them to maybe follow that person. You know, it really can if we're not careful, it can override more skillful means of how we are in the world. We can act out of fear. Always a dangerous proposition, especially if it's not a real immediate threat. So, just to remember that the essential cause of so much of our suffering and anxiety is our ignoring the nature of reality, not seeing things as they are. We come back to that point continually. So as I said, we get addicted to busyness, we get an undercurrent of fear, we want to distract ourselves, we run shopping, drinking, eating, whatever we do, because our immediate inclination, if we're not mindful, is to get away from it, get away from it. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense. There's a tiger, I want to get away from it. But if I'm just feeling this generalized free-floating anxiety, and there's nothing out there really presenting a danger, it probably makes sense to sit with it, look at it, welcome it in, and work with it. You know, what's going on with it? What's it doing in the body? Be mindful of what the body's doing in response to this thing that triggered me. What's my experience at the moment of it? You know, watch what comes up. Watch what arises. It's that simple and it's that hard at the same time. So as I said, in all my years in practice, you know, dealing with people with anxiety and fear, it was so clear that how much that tendency to avoid always made matters worse. Whatever the person was doing to try to get away from, reduce, eliminate, avoid that fear was always making matters worse. And until there could be some sense of embracing it, what we call exposure in terms of the therapeutic model, it wasn't going to get any better. They could take all the benzodiazepines or all the other medications, and it was just going to cover it up. It wasn't going to help them really live with it, be with it. And so it's why you hear me talk about, both as a psychologist and a Dharma teacher, the importance of embracing our fears and anxieties, leaning into them. I love that term, leaning into it. Remembering that avoidance only worsens our fears, makes them worse. And that if we cling to the idea that we should be worry-free or free of fear, it's only going to worsen the suffering. It's an unattainable goal. So let me close with a poem from my favorite poet, Mary Oliver, which addresses this very issue. It's called A Chance to Love Everything. She says, all summer I made friends with the creatures nearby. They flowed through the fields and under the tent walls, or padded through the door, grinning through their many teeth looking for seeds, suet, sugar, muttering and humming, opening the bread box, happiest when there was milk and music. But once in the night I heard a sound outside the door. The canvas bulged slightly. Something was pressing inward at eye level. I watched, trembling, sure I had heard the click of claws, the smack of lips outside my gauzy house. I imagined the red eyes, the broad tongue, the enormous lap. Would it be friendly too? Fear defeated me. And yet, not in faith and not in madness, but with the courage I thought my dream deserved, I stepped outside. It was gone. Then I whirled at the sound of some shambling tonnage. Did I see a black haunch slipping back through the trees? Did I see the moonlight shining on it? Did I actually reach out my arms toward it, toward paradise falling like the fading of the dearest, wildest hope? The dark heart of the story that is all the reason for its telling. So let's sit for just a minute.